was Jesus? You can't even ask the question without assuming an answer. From a traditional, Catholic, Christian perspective, Jesus is just as alive and well today as he was 2,000 years ago, so the question should be, who is Jesus? However, in modern times, many unbelievers and even some Christians think that he was just a man, or that he didn't exist at all. This is the pivotal claim of Christianity. Our beliefs rise and fall on Christ's claim to divinity. From that perspective, this might be the most important apologetics question today. So let's start with some basics. It's a verifiable fact that a Jewish man named Jesus lived and taught in the area between Jerusalem and Galilee, somewhere between 0 and 50 AD, before being put to death by the Romans. This was recorded by the Jewish historian Josephus, among others. Furthermore, we know that Peter, Paul, and the other early disciples were very real men. History records their deaths in the Roman persecutions. The historical consensus is that the four Gospels were written by 100 AD at the latest, and most of the New Testament letters were written by Paul only a few decades after Jesus' death. Therefore, even from an atheist perspective, the Gospel stories cannot be purely myths, just embellished histories of a real man. So we can be fairly certain, just from the historical record, that Jesus actually did claim to be God. However, this creates a dilemma. If Jesus did teach that he was God, it was either true or it wasn't. There's no gray area here. You can't just sort of be God, or sort of be all-powerful, or sort of be all-knowing. So it was either true or false. If it was false, though, he either knew it or he didn't know it. If he knew what he was teaching was false, then not only was he a liar, everything he taught was built on a lie. In John chapter 14, verse 10, Jesus says to his disciples, "The words I say to you, I do not speak of my own authority, but the Father, who dwells in me, does his works." So it is clear that Jesus' claim to be divine is central to all of his teachings. Therefore, if he was lying, it would make him a deceiver, a profiteer, someone who was only in it for the power and the fame. It's not as though he needed to claim to be God to get people to listen to him, since Israel at the time was full of wandering rabbis and teachers and prophets with their own significant followings. Many of these were rabble-rousers, and they were pushing for revolt against the Romans, and some of Jesus' followers thought that he was trying to do the same thing. John chapter 6, verse 15 says, "Perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the hills by himself." Furthermore, being a devout Jew, Jesus would know how the Jewish religious leaders would react to his claims. To call yourself God was a great blasphemy. In fact, it is precisely because of that claim that the chief priests handed him over to Pilate to be crucified in the first place. And ultimately, that is what proves he could not have been lying. Jesus was questioned and put on trial, first by the Jewish Sanhedrin, then by Pontius Pilate, and then even by King Herod. And still he claimed to be God, even under threat of death. From Jesus' Roman scourging to his agonizing journey carrying the cross, under the worst physical, verbal, and emotional abuse imaginable, Jesus did not recant, and he did not back down from what he had said. So he could not have simply been lying. That kind of torture would bring a denial from anyone who was not absolutely convinced of the truth. But what if Jesus was convinced he was telling the truth? What if he was simply mistaken? He wasn't telling the truth, but didn't know it. For starters, a reasonable measure of insanity is the distance between what I think I am and what I actually am. So if I think I am the best YouTube video maker that ever lived, then I am simply conceited and arrogant. But if I think I'm a piece of buttered toast, or a rocket ship, or an alien, then I'm pretty clearly insane. How much more so, then, would a person be off their rocker if they thought they were God, the supreme, omnipotent creator of the universe? In fact, this is a fairly well-recorded symptom of a condition known as narcissistic personality disorder, which is also called, colloquially, the God complex. Could Jesus have been a delusional narcissist? Let's look at the other symptoms. Since they believe themselves to be divine, people suffering from a God complex tend to be marked by extreme self-centeredness, including a noticeable lack of empathy and a great sense of their own self-importance. Furthermore, they tend to have difficulty following conversations that aren't directly about themselves, so they don't tend to reason well. Nothing could be farther from the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What we see in the Gospels is a kind, generous, selfless man who is wise enough to explain his teachings in parables that the lowest peasant could understand, while at the same time rebutting the most challenging of the Pharisees' questions. So Jesus couldn't have known he was wrong and been lying, and he also couldn't have been insane, which would be not knowing he was wrong. So that leaves only one possibility. He was telling the truth. The common counter-argument to this is, what if Jesus didn't say he was God? What if the Gospels had those stories added on later, as with other religious traditions? Well, that runs into the same paradox we just talked about, except this time about the apostles. We know they existed. We know from Paul's letters that they believed Jesus to be divine, the Christ, the Son of God, and we also know that they died for their faith by refusing to worship the emperor. So once again, were the apostles lying? Were they crazy? Or were they telling the truth? The extreme persecution the early Christians endured proves that they were sincere. You don't choose to be nailed to a cross and then lit on fire as a torch for your beliefs if you're not truly sincere about them. However, why couldn't they be crazy, or at least some of them? Why couldn't their great love for Jesus make them see him after his death and spread the story that he had been risen? The answer to this is that the Jewish priests and Romans very much wanted to destroy early Christianity. See, for example, Saul's actions before he became Paul. If these groups were able to reveal Jesus' body in the tomb, still very much dead, which would be the case if the apostles were hallucinating, then Christianity would have collapsed within 2 weeks of its beginning after the crucifixion. And if you argue that the apostles stole the body, then we're right back at the lying position. They weren't telling the truth and they knew it. But we've already shown that the position that the apostles were lying doesn't work. So once again, we're left with the only conclusion that they must have been telling the truth. That Jesus Christ really was risen from the dead, and therefore his claim to be the Son of God can be considered valid. I think this entire discussion illuminates something fundamental about attempts to find the historical Jesus by demythologizing the Bible, and why such attempts will always fail. Any attempt to explain Jesus also must explain Christianity, the religion he founded, and why it managed to survive and even thrive under such extreme persecution. The only explanation that fits the evidence we see is that Jesus Christ was, and is, the Son of God. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time and attention watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please leave a comment, and if you didn't like it, you had something you'd like to object to, please leave a comment on that as well. Ad Mahorem Dei Gloriam.